just 10 miles off the North American East Coast, in one of the world's busiest ship lanes, dolphins and whales frolic. The journey's goal is to discover a unique archipelago. The indigenous Lenape lived here in peaceful unity with nature until the arrival of the European colonialists. How has nature changed since then? What has been the impact of climate change and rising sea levels? A journey by boat takes us into this unknown island world hiding in plain sight with its tremendous natural wealth. The Verrazano Bridge marks the entry into a natural harbor that made it one of the most important marketplaces in the world. The bridge was named after the Italian seafarer Giovanni Verrazzano, who arrived here 500 years ago. Once the ships pass the bridge's 228-foot clearance, a panoramic view opens up onto New York, a city built on islands and surrounded by water. Eight million people live in this busy metropolis. There is hardly any room for animals and nature, but they are there, always ready to escape unpredictable danger. They live in parks, on and under streets, sometimes right in the center of the city life, but hardly noticed. For some of them, the city is an excellent hunting ground. Others benefit from the leftovers humans leave behind everywhere. Experts estimate that the number of species in New York City reaches into the thousands. Most all of them have perfectly adapted to city life. Parks, like Central Park, provide a natural habitat. Squirrels live here, as well as hundreds of kinds of birds, stopping here during migrations north or south. They depend on the insects they find here. What did New York look like 400 years ago? This question fascinates conservationist Eric Sanderson. He authored Mannahatta, a study that reconstructs New York's natural history in great detail. Along the northern tip of Manhattan, he kayaks into a bay that appears to be from another time.
For hundreds of years, people have looked at the river and they saw a means of transportation. But when I look at it, I actually see it as this hugely dynamic habitat, a habitat that's changing all the time. And not just in the water, but as it comes up into the land. And then, of course, the forest up above. Welcome to the Mannahatta, the island of many hills. And we're here at the northern end of Mannahatta, which is one of the greenest parts of Manhattan. It's one of the few places where you can come to Manhattan and actually get a sense of what it was like when Henry Hudson was here 400 years ago.
When the explorer Henry Hudson arrived here in 1609, Manhattan was a dense forest. The European colonialists who came after Hudson displaced the indigenous Lenape, took over the island, and blew up the rocks, to build the world's most modern city. Like Venice or Hong Kong, New York is a city built on an archipelago, surrounded by water. At the center lies Manhattan. The 23-square-mile island is the cradle of modern America. Its natural wealth is the main reason for the economic success of the city and the country. Even today, about 30% of Manhattan is green space, a habitat for animals like turtles and even coyotes. The entry to the harbor is marked by Liberty Island with its famous Statue of Liberty, and Ellis Island, home to the former Immigration Inspection Station. Across is the tip of America's largest island, Long Island, and the city's boroughs, Brooklyn and Queens. To the west is Staten Island, which can only be reached from Manhattan by its world-famous Orange Ferry. Two miles up the East River, wedged between Manhattan and Long Island, stretches Roosevelt Island. Every spring, the cherry blossoms attract numerous visitors. Many come by tram across the East River. Further up the East River towards Hell Gate are Mill Rock and Randall's Island, the latter so small that the Hell Gate Railway Bridge spans it. Hell Gate was once New York's most dangerous shipping passage. Over time, more than 1,000 ships were wrecked here against the rocks hidden beneath the surface of the water. Less than 100 years ago, those treacherous rocks were blown up. To the north of Hell Gate are South and North Brother Island. Uninhabited, both are unique bird sanctuaries. The rocks were formed toward the end of the last ice age, more than 16,000 years ago, and are the foundation of the New York archipelago. At the Inwood Hill Park in Manhattan, one can get an idea of what these rocks looked like before they were leveled to build the city. At the end of the 19th century, John Muir discovered that everything in nature is connected and dependent on something else. Eric Sanderson observed an extension of this principle that was essential for the development of nature in a city like New York.
When we were making the muir webs for Manhattan, we discovered something that I think is really interesting, which is that if you think about what a species needs, it rarely needs just one other species. More often it needs a bunch of other things. So for example, squirrels eat nuts, right? But what is nuts? It's not one kind of nut. It's acorns, it's hickory nuts, it's chestnuts, it's walnuts. And then each one of those, there's multiple kinds of trees. And so this idea is that if you depend on a group, then you're not dependent on any one individual. And that way you can be resilient even if the composition of the group changes over time. New York City is really at the forefront of this. We have this beautiful archipelago of islands and this beautiful productive estuary all around us. And every year, species keep coming back. The more we decrease pollution, the more we create habitat, the more species will return to the city.
New York's skyscrapers attract a bird of prey that for several decades was thought to be extinct, the peregrine falcon. The high-rise buildings are a perfect substitute for his natural habitat. Chris Nedoreski is a New York City employed biologist whose job requires highly acrobatic skills.
I've got animal carriers that we put the young birds in. These unfold and put animal carriers in. We've got climbing gear, like my climbing harness here. that I have to put on when I climb out on window ledges or on bridge girders.
The peregrine falcon is one of the fastest birds on the planet. It hunts at a speed of almost 200 miles per hour. The falcon's natural habitat includes mountain ledges where the female deposits her eggs without building a real nest.
Okay.
Some New York high-rises replicate those conditions perfectly.
Population was very healthy right up to about World War II, and then we started using pesticides like DDT for insect management, where it actually created a situation where the eggs became too thin to support an incubating female. So really we had no nesting pairs by the early 1960s, which means locally extinct.
Chris is going to fetch the falcon chicks from the nest for banding.
We're going to open these panels up very carefully, and I hear one of our adult birds. They're both out here. And the mother falcon is right in front of the nest. Back up there at the nest again. All right, so I'm gonna climb out and carefully retrieve the young. Gotta be careful for the adults.
For more than 35 years, Chris has been taking care of New York's falcons. Without him, they would not be here in New York City.
Okay, I'll take the carrier. Okay, here's one of the babies in the nest. Looks nice and healthy. I carefully put her in the carrier. Okay, nice and level. Here's one of the babies. And I'll take the second carrier. Oh, there she is at the nest. Here's the second baby. Looks healthy. All right, here's our second baby for the year. And we have one unhatched egg. This egg didn't hatch and at this point won't hatch. So we'll probably bring it in to have it tested. The peregrine falcon is one of those species that has shown its adaptability so well that in this concrete glass jungle that we have in these large cities, they're able to adapt and be really successful.
Francois Portman is an award-winning nature photographer. The Swiss native has been living in New York for more than 30 years. Every day he roams the urban jungle hunting for the perfect shot. It takes a great deal of patience and a good eye. He has photographed and filmed many animals living in the city. A visit to his studio offers a glimpse of his work.
The first thing you do is you go on the spot and you see what's going on. And then, of course, as a photographer, you do a lot of tries to have everything coming into place. Especially you have the light situation, how the birds and the wildlife, they're gonna react towards you and what they're gonna do, and you adapt. So that's what you learn. You see what's going on. And as a photographer, especially when you do wildlife, it's not like a fashion show where you can place the people or a feature film. You just try to get the best out of what you see and how you can actually get. There was a coyote in the park, and I packed my camera, tripod and everything. And as you can see, it's a difficult shot because it's full, it's very busy. So I spend probably 4 hours there. And of course, he's not doing anything because he's just waiting dusk to go on his hunt. Like, for example, here, this is a famous picture, the one on the book. The reason I say it's the most famous because it's been the most published. It's on a book cover, it's in magazines, in the country here, in Europe, in South Africa. But here I had actually a remote camera because I couldn't just stay near the nest, she wouldn't come. Actually, one day when I was placing the camera, the female kind of swooped over me as a warning. It's like, you're too close. And, you know, I quickly left my camera set up and I backed up where I was able to shoot these with a longer lens. So that's what you learn. And how the birds and the wildlife, they're gonna react towards you and what they're gonna do, and you adapt. It's all that.
Across the East River, industrial history has left scars. Brooklyn and Queens are separated by a waterway branching off from the East River. For more than 100 years, unbelievable amounts of highly poisonous liquid waste was dumped into the water. The result? Newtown Creek, a Superfund site and one of the most polluted waterways in America. Willis Elkins is the executive director of the Newtown Creek Alliance. He wants to discover how nature can help revitalize such a highly polluted site.
So at this point, we're about 3.5 miles from the East River, and we've gone through a number of these right-angle turns here. So the exchange of this water with the East River is very minimal.
Every week, Ellis inspects the creek and takes water samples. The stagnating water, far from the entrance to the East River, provides the best conditions. He protects himself with rubber gloves and a mask. For centuries, oil refineries, tanneries, and paint and chemical factories dumped their waste right into the creek. Tons of heavy metal and poisonous slick has accumulated on the bottom of the river. Together with the city of New York, the Newtown Creek Alliance succeeded in stopping nearby companies from continuing to pollute the water. But deep down on the riverbed lies a deadly time bomb.
With Superfund, the concern is really about contamination that's still making its way into the waterways.
Cleaning up the creek will take centuries, but the committed work of people like Willis offers hope that it will eventually get done.
So you'll see these things sticking in the water. Down on the water line here, this is a project we did about a year ago, and it's a way to try to experiment and see if we can create habitat. So what this is really designated for is for rib mussels. So by creating all these different surfaces using old oyster and clam shells and concrete, we're hoping that we'll see rib mussels colonize those spots.
The experiment to grow mussels along the breakwall was successful. Studies have confirmed that the water quality is measurably better where ribbed mussels are thriving. A single ribbed mussel can clean up to 15 gallons of water per day. The question is, can plants also help to revitalize the water? To find out, Willis and his team are running an important test.
These grasses are removing nutrients that create things like algae blooms. You can kind of see the discoloration in the water now. They're also putting oxygen into the water, which is a major issue, especially back here. And it's done incredibly well so far.
Conservation and environmental protection requires perseverance. For almost 25 years, the Newtown Creek Alliance has worked tirelessly to bring nature back to the creek.
There's 6, wow. There's another, 7, 8, this is amazing. You know, they're here because there's fish here. They're catching small fish, shrimp, maybe crabs, picking them out from the water. So that's a really 10 night herons in one spot is pretty amazing.
The Alliance's work depends on donations and people's participation. The Alliance's headquarters has a green roof. Working here is Lisa Bloodgood, the Newtown Creek Alliance Director of Advocacy and Education. Her goal is to fundamentally change this industrial area.
To have something like this in this area is really quite profound. We are completely surrounded by some of the heaviest industrial activities in all of New York City. Not a tree in sight, barely a patch of grass. Mostly, if there's anything growing and alive, it's an invasive weed. The function of a green roof is providing habitat, and a meadow like this with these kinds of plants in this area is incredibly valuable for its ecological function.
Volunteers replant empty lots made available by the city and companies in industrial districts. The plants have been carefully selected. They are native plants and a habitat for a wide range of insects. When this colorful butterfly shows up, Lisa and her helpers are especially happy. Its annual journey is impressive, and it is very picky when it comes to food.
So the monarch butterfly is this really special and unique butterfly, not only because it's like so stunningly beautiful, but it makes this incredible migration every year from a very small area in the mountains of Mexico, and they'll fly up into Canada and then return in the fall each year. And the populations are starting to crash. The caterpillars of the monarchs, this is the only food source that they will eat. These are very special plants, milkweed, and so we want to have it here. So when the monarchs are on their migration, when they're stopping, hopefully laying eggs on our Asclepias, so we've got them all over the place. It's because we've lost about 80% of the monarchs. And really, the biggest culprit and reason why is habitat loss. So that's why these plants are so special here. It's because, we're losing them in their natural settings. So we've got to make sure we're planting them as much as possible.
Not far from this industrial landscape on the other side of the East River, in Manhattan, the situation is different. Animals and plants adapt to the urban environment. A close look even reveals birds of prey and the rare mangrove rail. Once again, photographer Francois is on the hunt for a good shot. Every day he wanders the city for hours. He is particularly fascinated by the contrast between city and nature and how nature constantly expands. For years, he has watched a family of red-tailed hawks who live in a park near his apartment.
Since I got hooked up on birds in about 12 years ago, that's what made me get up every morning, get out and be motivated, especially to do more photography. So the contrast, usually it's what actually really drove me to photograph and try to show the contrast and record it and document it.
Francois' work requires strong focus and a quick hand. In addition, he needs to stay calm and work with precision.
In New York City, the most interesting and fascinating thing for me is to nature, basically, and the contrast with the city.
Tompkins Square Park in the East Village is a first-class hunting ground for red-tailed hawks. Not in the least because of New York's ubiquitous rats.
Here in Tompkins Square, which is my home turf somehow, we had some red-tailed hawks that moved in about 10, 11 years ago. At first, it was just like single birds, and then a pair started to establish itself and nested, I think the first time in 2014, nested on the Christodora building, where I was able to photograph it from different angle and even from behind the window where they were nesting. After that, they started nesting in different trees around here.
Francois has watched these birds for years and knows their nesting behavior inside and out. His experience is what allows him to keep finding stunning motifs. This was a successful day. After a long wait, the young hawks hatched, and Francois was there at the right time. Further south, at the nest of the peregrine falcon, the mother bird calls her young.
Now I have to be just very slow. They like to peck at you and they'll grab you with their talons, which are sharp, but they're not developed enough to really hurt you. And normally at this age, approximately 18 to 21 days old.
Before Chris bands the baby falcon, he checks her for illnesses. But everything is okay.
And we have a little measuring device which helps us confirm which size band. There's two different band sizes. These bands are from the Fish and Wildlife Service, which basically has information on it of the number. And Barbara's writing down these band numbers because we have to report these bands to the Federal Bird Banding Lab. Now before I crimp the band, I just make sure that it fits nice and loosely and it's nice and round. You can see here those long toes they have, almost goes the full length, that these birds will have in 3 weeks when they're basically at the same size as their parents, and it doesn't hurt the bird. So now I'm going to put a second band on to be able to observe this bird from a great distance using binoculars or a spotting scope. We've had birds in the New York City area that have survived 20 years with these bands on without interfering. And one of the challenges we have here in New York City is sometimes these birds will get into trouble when they take their first flight, which will be in about 3 weeks for this youngster.
Banding the birds helps in discovering whether the falcons stay in the city. Depending on the wind, sailing to Sheep's Head Bay can take a whole day. Of course, there is always the subway, but traveling by boat gives one a real picture of just how much New York is a city surrounded by ocean. Right after tying up in the harbor, a hungry cormorant attracts attention. A glance overboard brings a school of silver fish into view, a herring called Manhattan or bunkerfish. Not suitable for human consumption, for years it was processed into fish meal. But since 2012, the catch has been restricted, with surprising results. Only a few miles offshore, dolphins swim alongside the ship. Paul Ciaswerda is the founder of Gotham Whale. He has set out to document the number of whales in New York and relies on the help of regular people. Citizen scientists is what it is called here.
I began Gotham Whale after I retired from the New York Aquarium. And when we had whales and dolphins in that environment, we have to come out and see them on their own terms. And it's a wonderful experience to see them right here, so close to New York City.
There he is! There he is! 11 o'clock.
Up until recently, the water has not been clean enough to support the fish population. But now the fish are coming back and the whales are coming back to feed on the fish.
That the water is once again clean enough for whales and their prey is the direct result of the Clean Air and Water Act of 1972 that made polluting the waters punishable by law. "50 years later, the return of whales to New York is a testament to it.
There's a fish called menhaden, which is one of the most abundant fish in the ocean. And they are coming here to feed on the plankton that is encouraged by the Hudson River outflow. That brings all these nutrients down. And now the nutrients build up the algae and planktonic base, and the menhaden feed on that.
Helping to improve the water quality is one animal that has been on Earth for more than 250 million years, the oyster. By sailboat, the journey goes back to Brooklyn, along Coney Island, and part of the almost 500 miles of New York shoreline. The question is whether the self-healing power of nature can be used to improve the ecological state of New York. From the harbor through the Buttermilk Channel, the destination is Brooklyn Bridge Park. Today, the old schooner is an oyster restaurant. 100 years ago, New York's harbor was overgrown with oysters that were harvested and exported all over the world. Typhoid bacteria brought into the harbor through the city's sewer system ended this period, and New York oysters became inedible. Today, New York restaurants get their oysters from Long Island and even the West Coast. Oysters are not only gourmet food. They can also clean up to 50 gallons of water per day. For a spectacular environmental project, oyster shells are currently being collected from 80 New York restaurants. Pete Malinowski grew up on an oyster farm. He is one of the Billion Oyster Project's founders. The ferry ride from Manhattan is his daily commute to his workplace. It all started on Governor's Island. Here at the Harbor School, Pete Malinowski and Murray Fisher developed the idea to use 1 billion oysters to clean New York's polluted waters. Most important for that are these mountains of oyster shells. because oysters can only be raised on oyster shells.
These all come from restaurants in New York City, Brooklyn and Queens, but the oysters originate from farms all over the country. So there's, we call them Pacific oysters or Japanese oysters, and these are the most commonly cultured oysters in the world. So it's very important that we allow them to cure for a year out of the water before we introduce them back to the harbor, because we don't want to introduce any organisms or pathogens from those other places into New York Harbor.
These volunteers are thrilled by Peter's idea. They sort the shells and pack them into biodegradable bags that will become part of an oyster reef. The entire preparation is done by hand.
New York Harbor is 200,000 acres, and you can think of it as a 200,000-acre forest that's had all the trees removed. So it's just flat dirt. And what we're trying to do is rebuild the three-dimensional structure of the ecosystem by restoring oyster reefs. By doing that, we return some of those ecosystem services that used to be here. And the oyster reefs filter the water, provide food and habitat for hundreds of other species, stabilize the bottom, and they sort of are the ecosystem.
That the project's home is Governor's Island didn't happen by chance. The island itself is an ecological treasure. From 1775 on, it was used as a military base and closed to civilians. The abandoned quarters are part of the city's history. Uninhabited, the island is one of the last open spaces in New York City, a habitat for a wide range of birds, plants, and insects. In 2010, the Harbor School moved to the island, a specialized high school where the students learn everything from ship engineering to ocean biology. Situated in the middle of the harbor and equipped with docks, the location is perfect for the Billion Oyster Project. Before larvae will be set on the shells, they are pre-bred. Rebecca Ressner, hatchery manager at the Billion Oyster Project, explains how this works.
Right now we're out on our eco dock, which is on Governor's Island right outside our lab. So you can see the building right there. This is one of our many nursery sites. We do a lot of holding here of spat that we want to use for our education team for what we call ORS, Oyster Research Station Project. So that's what is being worked on here. These oysters are going to be bagged, and the education team will bring them to different middle schools around and install them around the harbor. These are little baby oysters here that are set on this clamshell. There's actually one here. Little variety of sizes as well.
Another one? Yeah. This data sheet? Okay.
So you got 6 so far. Oh, and this one. Is this a count here?
Until the oysters reach that stage, they are bred in this laboratory, and for that, they need a very special diet. Algae that Rebecca grows in this laboratory. Nothing is left to chance. Everything follows strict scientific rules.
We can look to see the quality and the health of our algae that we're going to use to feed our oysters. And we can also check the density and see how much food we're actually going to give our oysters.
The quality of the nutrition is essential for the growth of the larvae. The oysters will be fertilized and pre-grown in these tanks. The process is at once scientific and a gamble. An oyster produces between 6 and 8 million eggs. Whether an egg has been fertilized can only be discovered with the help of an electron microscope. Once the oysters are big enough, they will be packed in nets. But this method only works for smaller oyster reefs, so the experts thought of something new.
We actually set up a new system in Red Hook. It's our biggest setting location right now. We're setting gabions, which are these structures that are designed by our team on the island, we're using storage containers or shipping containers that are retrofitted into tanks. We have 4 of them, each about 8,000 gallons. We're gonna have a barge with a crane pull up and take the whole tank away from our Red Hook setting site.
This is a big day for Pete and his team. The largest oyster reef so far in the history of the Billion Oyster Project, with 15 million oysters, is to be set at the mouth of the Bronx River.
So this is the biggest installation we've done in New York City, and the most oysters we've ever put on at one site. All of our restoration sites are research sites, so we're looking to learn from this installation, understand what works well, what doesn't, and how we can, continue to iterate on our design process to have the best possible outcome for the oysters.
The oyster reefs have already helped to improve water quality and revitalize entire ecosystems. The return of the whales is living proof of that.
We began on board the American Princess in 2011. And that first year we only saw 3 sightings with a total of 5 whales. There were 2 sightings where we saw 2 whales at the same time. So we had a total of 5 whales for the whole season, 2011. Now we're up into the hundreds, 300 whales per season. I think there's been a constant improvement. Advocacy groups along the Hudson River have all worked to bring back clean water.
Soon, oysters will protect the south shore of Staten Island. This picturesque shoreline is extremely vulnerable to hurricanes and floods. Landscape architect Kate Orff wants to change that. The state of New York commissioned a 2-mile-long living breakwater. She and project manager Pippa Brashear remember.
We both lived here through Sandy and experienced this superstorm in our own personal lives. And, there's trauma. There's a lot of trauma. And we were almost 10 years after that.
I mean, it feels so long, but I just remember, coming here after Sandy, talking to people, seeing the photos, and really understanding how scared people were. And it's one thing to just, have flooding in your home. It's another thing to have buildings knocked off their foundation.
In 2012, Superstorm Sandy caused catastrophic damage in New York. Staten Island and the Rockaway Peninsula were particularly affected. People's desperate attempts to protect themselves failed.
Here you can see almost like this temporary, desperate measure of a temporary dune. Building walls does not solve the problem in this thick, 3-dimensional environment that we live in. It just pushes the problem further away and gets it out of sight and out of mind. In fact, it reduces our perception of risk and our ability to cope and adapt.
You can try to build a wall, but sea levels are rising, water's really powerful. You've got to work with it instead of against it.
Kate Orff runs the landscape architecture firm Scape in Manhattan. Together with her team, she developed a complete redesign of Staten Island's South Shore.
Okay, go ahead. And then here at the top of the shoreline, you can see
Living Breakwaters won a federal competition for ideas to better protect New York City from storms and floods. Data about water levels under different conditions was the basis for her concept. In a scaled-down model, wave parameters are being tested under real-life conditions. Instead of a massive concrete structure, The design takes advantage of a modular system. Oyster reefs are an important part of it. Planning for the construction, scheduled for fall 2021, is in high gear.
For each one, throughout.
Concrete, square units to which oysters will be attached are central to the entire project.
This is a scale model of an ecological concrete unit. It's one of these rods that have oysters on it, and they'll just start to grow, and then they'll grow on the units as well. In real life, it'll be about 4 feet by 4 feet and weigh 2.5 tons. This is actually a scale model as part of designing the breakwaters.
And this particular element is just here on the edges at the toe of the slope, so you can kind of see the scale, and then that breakwater is segmented, and it'll be put right out around 400 feet in front of these buoys.
Extreme weather conditions like Hurricane Sandy are becoming more frequent, triggered by climate change and the exploitation of nature for hundreds of years. A journey to the island world of New York raises the hope that a change in thinking can happen. But turning that into meaningful action is a whole other story.